The Krindax Empire had been scanning visitors for weapons for approximately 7,000 years, which in galactic terms meant they'd had plenty of time to perfect the art of being insufferably smug about it. Their detection arrays could identify a single atom of plutonium from 3 star systems away, recognize the molecular signature of every known explosive compound in the galaxy, and flag anything remotely resembling a projectile weapon before it got within orbital range of their carefully protected worlds. They'd published 17 academic papers on their security protocols, hosted 412 interstellar conferences on threat detection, and generally made sure that everyone from the Andromeda cluster to the Outer Rim knew exactly how impossible it was to bring anything dangerous onto Krindax Prime. What they couldn't do, apparently, was recognize a fashion accessory that doubled as a garrote. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start with the part where the galaxy's most advanced civilization spent 3 hours scanning a human woman and declared her completely harmless, which in retrospect was like declaring a supernova completely safe, because it was currently just a large star. The universe has a sense of humor, and it particularly enjoys making fools of people who think they've thought of everything. Krindax Prime orbited a blue giant in the Tertius sector, a planet that had been specifically terraformed to be as intimidating as possible. The architecture favored massive crystalline structures that jutted from the ground like the universe's most aggressive rock garden. And everything was built on a scale designed to make visitors feel approximately the size of bacteria. The Krindax themselves were tall, cerulean-skinned beings, with 4 arms and an evolutionary predisposition toward looking down on literally everyone, which their excessive height made quite easy. They'd spent the last millennium positioning themselves as the galaxy's premier neutral ground for diplomatic negotiations, mostly because their security was so tight that starting a fight on Krindax Prime was considered mathematically impossible. The summit scheduled for that particular rotation was standard diplomatic fare. 17 species, 43 delegates, approximately 916 competing interests, and the usual collection of grudges, territorial disputes, and passive-aggressive seating arrangements that made galactic politics such a delightful exercise in controlled chaos. The Vrexian Collective wanted mineral rights to 3 disputed asteroid fields. The Taloran Federation wanted the Vrexians to stop acting like they owned every floating rock in their quadrant. The Zephyrite Commonwealth wanted everyone to stop arguing and focus on the real issue, which was trade route access, and nobody wanted to deal with the Zephyrite Commonwealth because they brought interpretive dance presentations to every negotiation. And then there was Earth's representative, which already had several species placing quiet bets on how quickly the human would either start a war or accidentally insult someone important. Humans had only been on the galactic stage for about 40 years, which in diplomatic terms meant they were still figuring out which forks to use at the metaphorical dinner table, while everyone else watched with a mixture of concern and morbid curiosity. Commander Reina Vasquez stepped off the transport shuttle with the kind of confidence that suggested she either knew exactly what she was doing or had perfected the art of faking it. She was tall for a human, lean in the way that came from actually using muscles rather than just having them for decoration, with dark hair pulled back in a style that Earth's diplomatic corps probably described as professional, and everyone else would describe as severely practical. Her uniform was standard Earth Fleet issue, dark blue with minimal ornamentation, because humans had apparently decided that showing up to galactic summits looking like they were ready for either negotiation or immediate warfare kept other species appropriately uncertain. The Krindax security checkpoint was exactly as excessive as advertised. The scanning chamber was the size of a small concert hall, with enough technological equipment to outfit 3 research stations and a lighting scheme that suggested someone had confused security checkpoint with theatrical performance space. 12 Krindak security officers stood at attention around the perimeter, their 4 arms folded in a configuration that probably meant something threatening in their culture, but mostly looked like they were having trouble deciding what to do with all their limbs. Chief Security Administrator Vex Karn approached with the rolling gait typical of his species, and an expression of professional superiority that suggested he'd been doing this job too long and found it far beneath his considerable talents. "Human delegate," he announced, his translator rendering his multitonal speech into something approximating condescension in standard galactic. "You will submit to standard security protocols. Please remove all weapons, explosive devices, biological agents, electromagnetic pulse generators, quantum destabilizers, molecular disruptors, and any other implements of violence or destruction from your person." Reina smiled the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm not carrying any weapons." "The scanning will determine that," Vex Karn replied, gesturing to the examination platform with 2 of his 4 hands, which seemed excessive but was apparently how Krindaks indicated directions. "We detect everything. Our systems are infallible." "I've heard," Reina said, stepping onto the platform. "Read about it in all 17 of your published papers. Fascinating methodology, really. Particularly enjoyed the footnotes." If Vex Karn detected the sarcasm, he gave no indication. He probably got that a lot. Security personnel across the galaxy shared the universal trait of being magnificently immune to mockery, mostly because they'd heard every variation of "your security is excessive" approximately 7 million times, and had stopped caring somewhere around attempt number 12. The scanning began with a low hum that gradually built to a frequency that made Reina's teeth itch. Holographic displays blossomed around her like technological flowers, each one showing different analysis spectrums: molecular composition, energy signatures, biological markers, chemical analysis, quantum probability fields, threat assessment matrices. The Krindaks apparently believed in being thorough to the point of absurdity, which was admirable if you liked that sort of thing. 3 hours later, because efficiency was apparently not part of the Krindak security doctrine, Vex Karn reviewed the results with the air of someone who'd found exactly what he'd expected to find, which was nothing remotely interesting. Analysis complete. No weapons detected. No explosive compounds. No banned substances. No threat signatures. He paused at one readout, his head tilting in a way that suggested confusion. "You are carrying an unusually high amount of iron in your bloodstream." "Anemia?" Reina replied cheerfully. "Supplements. And your skeletal structure contains significantly more calcium than predicted for your species average. Milk, lots of it. Good for bones. You should try it." Vex Karn decided this wasn't worth pursuing and continued through the inventory. Personal communication device. Compliant with summit regulations. Datapad containing diplomatic briefings. Allowed. Clothing items. He highlighted a holographic representation of her uniform. Standard textile composition. No embedded technology. No concealed components. His display moved to her waist. Accessory item identified as primitive flexible restraint for garment security. Composition: Earth origin leather, metal alloy buckle, no electronic components, no chemical treatments beyond standard preservation compounds. Classification: harmless. That belt, that absolutely ordinary belt that Reina had worn every day for 3 years, that she'd bought from a market stall in Istanbul during shore leave, that had cost her approximately 30 credits and had nothing remarkable about it except that it fit well and didn't pinch, would within 6 hours become the most discussed piece of human attire in galactic diplomatic history. But at that moment, it was just a belt. And Vex Karn, having confirmed that the human carried nothing more dangerous than an iron deficiency and unfashionable clothing, waved her through to the diplomatic sector with the bored efficiency of someone who just spent 3 hours confirming that water was indeed wet. "Welcome to Crindax Prime," he said in a tone suggesting he neither welcomed her nor cared about her presence. "Proceed to Conference Hall 7. Summit begins in Mahimadamat in 2 standard hours. Refreshments will be provided. Please do not start any wars." "Wouldn't dream of it," Reina replied, collecting her datapad and heading toward the massive archway that led deeper into the complex. Behind her, Vex Karn was already processing the next delegate, a Talaran ambassador who was arguing about whether his ceremonial headcrest constituted a weapon, which it probably didn't, but Talarans loved arguing on principle. Conference Hall 7 was exactly as imposing as the Crindax could make it, which meant it was roughly the size of a sports arena and decorated in a style that screamed, "Look how important we are," in 17 different architectural languages. The ceiling arced overhead at a height that seemed unnecessary unless you were planning to host visiting spacecraft, which honestly might have been an option given Crindax tendencies. Seating was arranged in a circular configuration around a central platform because the Crindax believed circular arrangements prevented hierarchical disputes, though in practice, it just meant everyone could glare at everyone else with equal efficiency. Delegates filtered in with the usual pre-summit mixture of posturing and networking. The Vrexian delegation arrived in a formation that suggested military precision, which wasn't surprising given that Vrexians approached everything with military precision, including breakfast. The Talaran group entered arguing with each other, which was their natural state. Zephyrite glided in, making unnecessary hand gestures and humming in harmonics that probably meant something profound in their culture, but sounded like a malfunctioning air conditioning unit. Reina took her assigned seat in the human sector, which was positioned between the Andorian Confederacy and the Xyloth territories, presumably because someone in the seating committee had a sense of humor about putting the new species between 2 civilizations known for having strong opinions about everything. She nodded politely to the Andorian delegate, a crystalline being who acknowledged her with a refracted light pattern that her translator helpfully informed her meant either greetings or "I find your presence tolerable," which in diplomatic terms was practically a declaration of friendship. The summit opened with the standard formalities: welcome speeches, acknowledgement of territories, recognition of grievances. The usual diplomatic throat clearing that happened before anyone got to actual negotiations. The Crindax moderator, an impressively tall individual named Korthax, who had apparently been doing this job since before most species in the room had achieved spaceflight, droned through the procedural requirements with the enthusiasm of someone reading a technical manual for the 9,000th time. And then Ambassador Throcknar of the Vrexian Collective stood up and decided to be the worst version of himself, which was saying something because Vrexians had elevated being terrible to an art form. Throcknar was a prime example of his species, which meant he looked like someone had taken a crocodile, made it bipedal, added extra teeth for intimidation purposes, and given it an inflated sense of self-importance. Vrexians were apex predators on their homeworld, and they'd never let anyone forget it, particularly not in diplomatic settings where reminding everyone of your predatory heritage was considered psychological warfare. "Before we proceed with these negotiations," Throcknar announced, his voice carrying the kind of growl that suggested his species had evolved vocal cords specifically for sounding threatening, "I feel it necessary to address the presence of certain primitive delegations at this summit." Several heads turned. Everyone knew who he meant. Humans were the newest species at the table, and certain older civilizations had strong opinions about letting them participate in adult discussions. The Vrexian Collective questions the wisdom of including species who have barely mastered interstellar travel in discussions of territorial sovereignty and resource allocation. Throcknar continued, clearly warming to his subject. Perhaps the humans should observe rather than participate. Learn from their betters before presuming to have opinions on matters beyond their comprehension. The room went quiet with the particular silence that happens when someone says something diplomatically catastrophic and everyone else is waiting to see what happens next. The Krindak's moderator looked like he wanted to intervene, but couldn't quite figure out if this violated any specific protocols, which it probably did. But Vrexians had expensive lawyers, and nobody wanted that particular fight. Reina could have let it go. Should have let it go. Earth's diplomatic guidelines were very clear about not engaging with obvious bait from species looking for confrontation. The smart move was to smile politely, file a formal complaint through proper channels, and let the bureaucratic process handle it over the next 3 to 6 months. But Reina had spent the last 6 hours on a transport with malfunctioning climate control, 3 hours being scanned like a suspicious package, and had been awake for roughly 28 hours because jump lag was absolutely real, and anyone who said otherwise was lying. She was tired. She was irritated. And Ambassador Throcknar had just made the catastrophic mistake of assuming that humans responded well to condescension. Ambassador Throcknar, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall with the kind of calm that preceded terrible decisions. I appreciate your concern for my primitive understanding. Perhaps you could clarify something for my simple human brain. Throcknar's head swiveled toward her, his predatory eyes narrowing. Yes? Your species claims ownership of the Tertius asteroid fields based on historical precedent, correct? The Vrexian Collective has maintained mining operations in that region for 400 years. Our claim is undisputable. Interesting. Because according to the Galactic Charter, historical precedent only applies if the claiming species can demonstrate continuous occupation or usage. Your own reports show a 70-year gap in mining operations between 2247 and 2317. Standard year, of course. Wouldn't want to confuse my primitive calendar system with yours. The silence in the room shifted quality, becoming the kind of quiet that happened when someone had just deployed actual facts in what was supposed to be a dominance display. Several delegates checked their own data pads. The Talaran representative made a sound that might have been a laugh. Throcknar's scales shifted color slightly, which in Vrexian body language indicated rising aggression. You dare question the integrity of Vrexian claims? I'm questioning your math, Ambassador. Different thing entirely. Though I understand how you might confuse the two, what with my primitive education and all. That was the moment. The precise instant when Ambassador Throcknar decided that diplomatic protocol could go to whatever hell his species believed in, and that this upstart human needed to be taught a lesson in respecting her betters. He rose from his seat with the kind of movement that was designed to be threatening, all coiled muscle and predatory intent, his considerable height allowing him to loom impressively. Perhaps, he growled, moving around the circular table toward the human sector. You need a more direct demonstration of why younger species should know their place. The Krindak's security officers along the walls shifted nervously. This was technically a breach of summit protocols, but Throcknar was a major diplomatic figure, and security intervention in what might be just aggressive posturing could cause an interstellar incident. Also, and this was the critical part, their scans had confirmed that the human was unarmed. What exactly was she going to do? Throw harsh language at him? Reina stood as Throcknar approached, which meant she had to look up at him, because Vrexians averaged 7 feet tall and used every inch of it for intimidation. She didn't step back. didn't flinch. Just maintained eye contact with the kind of calm that should have been a warning sign to anyone paying attention. "Ambassador," she said quietly, "I'd strongly suggest you return to your seat." "Or what?" Throcknar leaned closer, his teeth very visible, his breath smelling like something had died in his mouth recently, and he'd forgotten to mention it to anyone. "You'll file a complaint? Lodge a protest? Run crying to your primitive homeworld?" Reina's hands moved to her waist. "No," she said, her fingers finding the buckle of her belt. "I'm going to educate you about human history." "And what?" Throcknar's voice dripped with contempt. "Do you intend to do with that primitive clothing accessory?" That was his last coherent question for a while. The belt came off with a practiced motion that suggested this wasn't the first time Reina had considered its alternative applications. Leather, 3 feet long, flexible enough to coil, but rigid enough to maintain form. Metal buckle at one end, providing weight and purchase. Designed for holding up trousers, but adaptable to, say, demonstrating why humans had spent several thousand years being creative about killing each other before they ever reached the stars. Throcknar realized something had gone terribly wrong approximately half a second before the belt looped around his neck, which in evolutionary terms was far too late to do anything about it. His forearms came up instinctively, trying to grab the leather. But Reina had already pivoted, using his own forward momentum and considerable mass against him, dropping her weight and pulling in a direction that physics and leverage made absolutely inevitable. The Vrexian ambassador hit the floor with a sound like a dropped piano, which was appropriate because he weighed about as much. The belt tightened with professional efficiency, cutting off his extremely aggressive breathing and reducing his threatening growls to strained wheezing. Reina's knee found the center of his back, pinning him with the kind of technique that was taught in Earth's military training and practiced by anyone who'd spent time in situations where formal weapons weren't available, but improvisation was highly encouraged. "Here's your history lesson," Reina said conversationally, her voice remarkably steady for someone who was currently strangling an alien ambassador with a fashion accessory. "Humans spent approximately 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing each other with whatever was handy. Rocks, sticks, pieces of string. We got very, very good at it. We had entire martial arts dedicated to using farming tools as weapons. We turned cooking implements into instruments of death. We fought wars with sharpened pieces of metal tied to sticks and called it military strategy. Throcknar's struggles were becoming less coordinated, his forearms flailing with decreasing effectiveness. His scales had shifted to a color that probably indicated oxygen deprivation, which was the universal sign of having made terrible life choices. "The thing about being a young species," Reina continued, adjusting her grip slightly as Throcknar tried to roll, "is that we remember being primitive. We remember when everything was a potential weapon because we couldn't afford to specialize. You've had advanced technology for so long, you've forgotten how to improvise. We haven't. Security was finally mobilizing, but they were moving with the uncertainty of people who'd never actually had to deal with violence at a diplomatic summit because their scanners had always caught everything dangerous before it arrived." Vex Karn was shouting into a communication device, probably calling for backup, definitely updating his resume because this was going to require so much paperwork. The Andorian delegate had moved to what it considered a safe distance, its crystalline structure refracting light in patterns that its species used to express shock. The Talaran representatives were recording everything, because Talarans documented literally everything, and would absolutely be dining out on this story for decades. The Zephyrite had stopped humming and were just staring, which was probably the most attention they'd paid to anything that wasn't interpretive dance in their entire civilization's history. Now, Reina said, her tone shifting to something that approximated reasonableness. I'm going to loosen this belt. You're going to return to your seat. We're going to continue this summit like professionals. And you're going to remember that primitive doesn't mean helpless. Are we clear? Throcknar managed a wheeze that might have been agreement or might have been a dying gasp. Either way, Reina took it as consent and released the pressure, unwinding the belt with the same practiced efficiency she'd used to deploy it. The Vrexian ambassador collapsed into a gasping heap, his forearms clutching at his throat, his predatory dignity somewhat diminished by the fact that he'd just been choked unconscious by what the security scanners had classified as a harmless clothing accessory. Security finally arrived in force. A dozen Krindax officers surrounding the scene with weapons drawn, and expressions suggesting they were really hoping someone would explain what exactly they were supposed to do about a human who just weaponized business-casual attire. Vex Karn pushed through the crowd, his forearms gesturing in configurations that probably meant multiple variations of what the actual hell in Krindax body language. You attacked a delegate, he sputtered, his professional composure completely shattered. With your belt. He attacked first. Reina replied calmly, threading the belt back through her uniform's loops with the air of someone who just finished a mildly strenuous workout. I defended myself, with available resources. Your scans confirmed I wasn't carrying weapons. I wasn't. I was carrying a belt. The fact that I know how to use a belt for purposes beyond holding up my pants isn't my problem. It's your scanner's problem. That's semantic manipulation. No, that's the difference between weapons and tools. A weapon is designed to cause harm. A tool can be used to cause harm. Your scans caught weapons. They didn't catch tools. Not my fault your civilization is so advanced you've forgotten that literally anything can be dangerous in the right hands. The Krindax moderator had finally found his voice, though it came out several octaves higher than his usual diplomatic register. This is an outrage, an assault on a diplomatic delegate. Security protocols have been violated. The sanctity of this summit has been compromised. Actually, the Talaran delegate interjected, reviewing his recordings with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found a legal loophole the size of a small moon. According to Section 17 of the Summit Conduct Guidelines, delegates are permitted to defend themselves against physical aggression using reasonable force. Ambassador Throcknar initiated physical contact with clear, aggressive intent. The human's response, while creative, falls within the technical definition of self-defense. Self-defense with a belt. Vex Karn looked like he was having some kind of existential crisis, which was fair because his entire professional identity was built on preventing exactly this kind of situation, and he just failed spectacularly at it. The guidelines don't specify which methods of self-defense are acceptable. The Talaran continued, clearly enjoying himself. They just say reasonable force. Given the size and strength differential between humans and Vrexians, I'd argue that using a flexible restraint device to immobilize a larger opponent demonstrates remarkable restraint. She could have gone for the eyes. Several delegates made uncomfortable sounds at that image. Reina smiled pleasantly, neither confirming nor denying that she'd considered that option. Throcknar had recovered enough to sit up, though his breathing still sounded like a malfunctioning air recycler. His scales had shifted to a color that probably indicated humiliation mixed with residual oxygen deprivation and a strong desire to be literally anywhere else. This is not over, he managed to rasp. Actually, Reina said, I think it is. You want to escalate this? We can talk about how you initiated physical aggression at a neutral diplomatic summit in front of 43 witnesses and multiple recording devices. or we can call this a mutual misunderstanding, continue the summit, and never speak of it again. Your choice. Throcknar clearly wanted to choose violence, but his survival instincts finally caught up with his ego and informed him that challenging someone who just choked him unconscious with a belt was probably not going to end well. He settled for a glare that promised future retribution, which in diplomatic terms meant he was admitting defeat but maintaining enough face to avoid complete humiliation. "Resume your seats," Korthax commanded, his voice suggesting he was about 3 seconds from retiring early and becoming a moisture farmer on some quiet agricultural world. "All of you, we will continue this summit, and there will be no further incidents, or I will personally space everyone involved regardless of diplomatic immunity." The moderator probably couldn't actually do that, but everyone was too rattled to argue. Delegates shuffled back to their positions with the nervous energy of students who'd just witnessed a fight in the cafeteria and weren't sure if they were in trouble too. Reina returned to her seat, her belt securely fastened, her expression calm. Her datapad already open to the next item on the agenda, as if she hadn't just strangled an alien ambassador in front of the galaxy's diplomatic elite. The summit continued. The mineral rights got discussed. The trade routes got negotiated. The Zephyrites did their interpretive dance presentation, and everyone pretended to appreciate it. But the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. Delegates who'd been planning to dismiss the human representative now gave her a wide berth and actual attention when she spoke. The Vrexian delegation sat very quietly and didn't make any more comments about primitive species. And Vexkarn spent the entire rest of the summit staring at Reina's belt like it was a quantum anomaly that had personally betrayed him. The aftermath rippled through galactic diplomatic channels with the speed and destructive force of a supernova. Within 6 hours, every major government from the core worlds to the outer territories had received full reports, complete with video documentation that the Talorans had helpfully distributed to everyone they could think of, and several people they couldn't. Within 12 hours, the incident had been analyzed by security experts, diplomatic corps, and approximately 47 different committees, who all wanted to understand how exactly a human had weaponized clothing at the galaxy's most secure diplomatic venue. Within 24 hours, Earth's diplomatic service received 312 requests for information about human improvised combat techniques, and 79 complaints about dangerous cultural practices, which was rich coming from civilizations that included species who could secrete acid and others who reproduced by explosion. The Krindax Empire convened an emergency security review. Vexkarn found himself in front of a panel of his superiors, trying to explain how their supposedly infallible scanning system had missed a threat, and being forced to repeatedly state that no, the belt had not shown up as a weapon. Because it technically wasn't a weapon, it was a piece of clothing that a human had repurposed through the application of creativity and violence. "So you're saying," his supervisor had asked with the patience of someone who was absolutely going to fire him later, "that we need to scan for potential threats, not just actual threats?" "That would require scanning for literally everything," Vexkarn had replied miserably. "Everything can potentially be a threat. A shoe could be a bludgeon, a datapad could be a projectile, a drinking vessel could be used to deliver poison or as a striking implement. If we scan for potential rather than actual threats, we'd need to strip every delegate naked and send them into the summit chamber with nothing but their own skin. And knowing what we now know about humans, they'd probably find a way to weaponize that too." The panel had not found this helpful, but they also couldn't argue with the logic. After 7,000 years of perfecting weapons detection, they'd been defeated by the fundamental principle that sufficiently motivated beings could turn literally anything into an instrument of violence if they were creative enough. The human clothing accords debate lasted 3 weeks and generated enough paperwork to constitute an environmental hazard. Various species proposed banning humans from wearing belts at diplomatic functions. Others suggested mandatory scanning of all accessories. The Talleyrand delegation, still gleefully dining out on their recordings of the incident, proposed that instead of restricting humans, perhaps other species should simply avoid attacking them, which was shot down as being too sensible for serious diplomatic consideration. The compromise, reached after substantial argument and one minor fistfight between the Zephyrite and Andorian delegations over an unrelated matter, was that delegates could wear whatever they wanted, but security forces would receive additional training in creative threat assessment. This training basically consisted of assuming that anything a human touched could potentially become lethal and planning accordingly, which several species argued was discriminatory, but which security forces across the galaxy privately admitted was probably just realistic. Other species began experimenting with their own accessories. The Talleyrand ambassador attempted to weaponize his ceremonial sash, with results that medical personnel described as unfortunate but educational. A Zephyrite delegate tried to use their harmonic crystals offensively, which mostly just gave everyone in a 3-meter radius a headache. The Andorians, being crystalline beings, pointed out that their entire bodies were technically accessories, and would everyone please calm down before this got more ridiculous. Reina's reputation spread like a particularly aggressive computer virus. The Belt Strangler became her unofficial title in diplomatic circles, which she neither encouraged nor discouraged. Future summit invitations included specific clauses about her attendance, with some delegations requesting her presence specifically because they hoped she'd strangle someone they didn't like, and others requesting she not attend because they were afraid they might be that someone. Earth's diplomatic corps was torn between being mortified that their representative had caused an interstellar incident and being impressed that she'd done it with a belt. The official statement was carefully worded disapproval. The unofficial statement, conveyed through back channels and knowing looks, was something along the lines of, "That's our girl." Throcknar recovered physically, though his dignity remained critically injured. The Vrexian collective issued a formal protest, which everyone filed away and ignored because the video evidence made it very clear who'd started the confrontation and who'd finished it. Throcknar himself never again attended a summit where humans were present, which was probably good for his blood pressure and definitely good for his continued ability to breathe without assistance. 6 months later, at a trade negotiation on Andorian Prime, a delegate from a species known for aggressive posturing made the mistake of commenting on how primitive human customs were. Reina had simply reached for her belt buckle, and the delegate had immediately apologized and offered very favorable trade terms. She hadn't even needed to remove the belt. Just the gesture was enough. The galaxy learned, slowly and with substantial reluctance, what Earth's military forces had known for centuries: that humans were extraordinarily good at violence, that they'd spent millennia practicing it with whatever materials were available, and that the line between tool and weapon was largely a matter of intent and creativity. Advanced technology was useful, but sometimes all you needed was 3 feet of leather and the knowledge of exactly where to apply pressure. The Krindax Empire updated their security protocols 17 times over the following year. They added new scanners, new algorithms, new threat assessment matrices. They trained their personnel in human combat techniques, human psychology, human history. They published a revised paper on weapons detection that was twice as long as their previous version and significantly more humble in its conclusions. And every single security checkpoint in their empire now included a small disclaimer, added by Vex Karn himself before his forced retirement to that agricultural world he'd been thinking about. Note: the classification of items as harmless assumes that the carrier lacks both creativity and hostile intent. In cases involving humans, assume neither. Reina Vasquez continued her diplomatic career, representing Earth at summits, negotiations, and conferences across the galaxy. She never again had to use her belt as a weapon, though she wore it to every single diplomatic function she attended. It became her signature, that belt, more recognizable than her uniform or her credentials. Other species would see it and remember that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't advanced technology or superior firepower. It was the fundamental, terrifying reality that humans looked at literally everything and asked, "But could I kill someone with this if I needed to?" And had spent 10,000 years answering that question, with increasingly creative variations of yes. The galaxy had better sensors, better weapons, better technology. But they'd had it for so long that they'd forgotten the basic principle that the most dangerous thing in any room wasn't the most advanced piece of equipment. It was the being who remembered how to survive without it. And that's the story of how a belt became the most famous accessory in galactic diplomatic history. How an ambassador learned that primitive didn't mean helpless. And how the Crindax Empire discovered that you could scan for every known weapon in the universe and still miss the most dangerous one of all. Human ingenuity combined with a willingness to get creative when someone deserved strangling. The universe has a sense of humor, and it particularly enjoys reminding advanced civilizations that sometimes the most sophisticated response to a problem is a 3-foot piece of leather applied with sufficient force and excellent timing. The Crindax had spent 7,000 years perfecting their security. It took one human and one belt approximately 30 seconds to teach them that perfect security was an illusion, and that the real threat was never the weapons you could detect. It was the ones you dismissed as harmless.